At my son's wedding, I accidentally spilled a glass of red wine on my daughter-in-law's mother's $50,000 dress. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I just stood there, holding the empty glass, watching the red stain bloom across ivory silk like a slow, deliberate accusation. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. I never imagined that one small accident would reveal something far uglier than a ruined dress. The ceremony had been beautiful. It was held at a vineyard just outside Napa, the kind of place with rolling hills and rows of grapevines stretching into golden sunlight. White roses lined the aisle. Crystal chandeliers hung from a clear tent canopy. Everything shimmered, polished, curated, expensive. My son Daniel looked handsome in his tailored tuxedo. I remember thinking how much he resembled his father at that age. Tall, nervous smile, pretending to be confident. I had chosen a soft blue dress for the occasion. Nothing extravagant, just elegant. Something modest, but dignified. At 72, I no longer compete for attention. I simply show up with grace. Or at least, I try to. The reception was already in full swing when it happened. Music drifted lazily through the vineyard air. Guests laughed around tall cocktail tables. Servers moved quietly with trays of champagne and Pinot Noir. I was standing near the edge of the tent, watching Daniel and his bride take photos beneath an arch of white flowers. I felt proud, a little emotional, but mostly proud. That's when she approached me. Margaret, my daughter-in-law's mother. She was wearing the dress everyone had been whispering about all afternoon. Custom designed, imported silk, reportedly worth $50,000. I'd overheard one of the bridesmaids mention the number with awe. $50,000. I tried not to calculate how many years of my late husband's careful saving that would represent. Margaret smiled at me, a smile too polished to be sincere. Well, she said, her voice smooth as chilled wine. I suppose we both finally made it here. I wasn't sure what she meant. I simply nodded. Before I could respond, someone brushed past me from behind. A quick movement. A slight collision of elbows. The wine glass tilted. Time slowed in the cruelest way. A thin stream of red arced through the air and landed squarely against the front of Margaret's immaculate ivory dress. Gasps rippled outward like wind across water. The music didn't stop, but conversations did. Margaret looked down. The stain spread slowly, soaking into silk. Her hand trembled, not dramatically, just enough. Oh, I said softly. I reached for a napkin, instinctively. I am so sorry. That was an accident. My voice was steady. Years of composure have a way of settling into your bones. Margaret did not scream. She did not curse. She simply looked at me. And then she said, calmly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "This is exactly why some people don't belong at events like this." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The words slipped into the air and hung there. I felt eyes on me, dozens of them. Daniel turned from across the tent, confusion flashing across his face. My daughter-in-law, Claire, followed his gaze. She walked toward us quickly, heels sharp against the wooden flooring. "What happened?" she asked. Margaret answered before I could. "Your mother-in-law decided to redecorate my dress." A soft ripple of laughter emerged from somewhere behind us. Claire looked at me. For a moment, just one moment, I searched her face for kindness. Instead, I found calculation. "Oh my God," she sighed, not in concern, but in exasperation. "Are you serious right now?" "It was an accident," I said quietly. Claire pressed her lips together. "This dress was custom-made in Milan. It's insured, but still." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I understood what she meant. You don't ruin something that expensive. You don't embarrass the bride's family. You don't stain perfection. A wedding planner hurried over with club soda and white towels. Margaret allowed herself to be fussed over like royalty. I stepped back. No one touched me. No one asked if I was all right. Daniel finally approached, his jaw tight. "Mom," he said carefully, "can you just give us a minute?" "A minute." I nodded. I handed the empty wine glass to a passing server and walked toward the edge of the vineyard. The sun was beginning to lower behind the hills. Golden light softened everything it touched, except the tension. I could still hear faint whispers behind me. 72 years old, and I felt like a clumsy child again. But here is what no one noticed. When that wine hit silk, something else spilled. 2 years of quiet slights. Small exclusions. Carefully worded invitations that arrived late. Family photos I was never told about. Rehearsal dinners I wouldn't feel comfortable at. I had told myself it was imagination. Generational differences. Modern weddings. But standing there, watching Margaret dab at her perfect life, while my daughter-in-law glared at me like I had sabotaged her happiness, I realized something. This wasn't about a dress. It was about belonging. And apparently, I did not. A breeze passed through the vines, carrying the scent of grapes and earth. Behind me, applause erupted as Daniel and Claire began their first dance. No one came to find me. Not yet. I stood there, looking at my reflection in a window pane. Silver hair pinned neatly, blue dress unwrinkled, hands still steady. I didn't cry. I didn't leave. I just watched. Because accidents reveal more than intention ever could. And before that night was over, I would understand exactly why that wine had to fall. Not on silk, but on illusion. I didn't go back inside right away. From where I stood, I could see the glow of the reception tent against the darkening sky. Laughter rose and fell in soft waves. Glasses clinked. Music carried through the vineyard air. It looked like a dream. And in many ways, it was. Claire had planned this wedding for over a year. I remember the first time she showed me the venue brochure. Heavy cardstock. Embossed lettering. She ran her fingers across the photo of the vineyard and said, "It has to be somewhere refined." Refined. I had smiled and told her it was beautiful. That morning, I woke up before sunrise in my small guest room at the inn nearby. I took my time getting ready. I curled my hair carefully. I fastened the pearl necklace Daniel gave me on my 70th birthday. The one he said made me look timeless. I practiced my smile in the mirror. Not because I was unhappy, because I didn't want to look out of place. At breakfast, I sat alone while other families gathered in clusters. Mothers adjusting veils. Fathers giving advice. Bridesmaids laughing too loudly over mimosas. Claire and her mother were already downstairs when I arrived. They were surrounded by stylists and garment bags and quiet urgency. Margaret glanced at me over her shoulder. "You're up early," she said. I didn't want to miss anything, I replied. She gave me that same polished smile. The kind that never reaches the eyes. "Well," she said lightly, "these things can get overwhelming." I offered to help. With flowers. With seating cards. With anything. Claire shook her head gently. "It's handled." Handled. The word stayed with me. Throughout the afternoon, I noticed small things. My name wasn't on the seating chart at the family table at first. It was later corrected, quietly, after I pointed it out. The photographer gathered immediate family for pictures. I stood nearby until someone awkwardly waved me in. Even during the rehearsal dinner the night before, I had been seated at the end of the long farmhouse table. Close enough to see everyone. Far enough not to belong in the center. I told myself I was imagining it. Weddings are stressful. Emotions run high. But standing outside that tent now, after the wine had stained silk and Margaret's voice had cut through the air, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. It wasn't about a dress worth $50,000. It was about who was considered valuable. Inside, applause erupted again. Someone tapped a fork against a champagne glass, calling for speeches. I smoothed my blue dress. I straightened my shoulders. And then I walked back toward the light. Because if they believed I didn't belong there, they were about to learn something very important about underestimating a woman who has spent a lifetime quietly observing. When I stepped back inside the reception tent, the air felt different. Not louder, not quieter, just tighter. Claire was standing near the head table beside her mother. Margaret's dress had been partially treated. The red stain had faded into a dull pink shadow, still visible under the lights if you looked closely enough. People were pretending not to stare. That's the thing about embarrassment. It never needs an announcement. It moves through a room silently. Claire spotted me immediately. Her expression shifted, not to anger exactly, but to something sharper. Controlled irritation. She walked toward me slowly, heels sinking slightly into the wooden floor panels. "Are you okay?" she asked. The question sounded polite, but her tone was rehearsed. "I'm fine," I answered. She folded her arms lightly. Not defensive, just closed. "You have to understand," she said, lowering her voice. "Today is very important to us." "I know," I replied. "My mother has put so much into this wedding. We all have." I noticed she didn't say you. I nodded again. "It was an accident," I said quietly. Claire exhaled through her nose. "Of course. But sometimes accidents happen when people aren't paying attention." There it was. Not a shout. Not an accusation. A suggestion. A suggestion that I had been careless, distracted, out of place. I was standing still, I said calmly. Someone bumped into me. She tilted her head slightly. Well, it doesn't really matter now, does it? Behind her, I saw Daniel watching us. He didn't step in. He didn't interrupt. He just watched. That hurt more than Margaret's comment. Claire softened her voice just enough to sound reasonable. Maybe it would be better if you sat down for a bit. Just keep things low profile. Low profile. As if I were a problem that needed managing. I looked around. The string lights above us glowed warmly. Guests were settling back into their seats. The DJ adjusted the microphone for the next announcement. Everything looked perfect again, except the line that had quietly been drawn. I don't need to hide, I said gently. Her jaw tightened for a split second before she smiled again. That public smile, the one for photographers. No one's saying you need to hide. But her eyes said something else. They said, don't cause more trouble. She turned and walked back toward the head table without waiting for my response. I remained standing where I was. And for the first time that evening, I noticed something important. Margaret wasn't upset about the dress anymore. She was speaking animatedly to two guests, laughing lightly, one hand gesturing dramatically toward the faint stain as if it were a humorous anecdote already. The crisis had passed. The embarrassment, however, had not. It had simply shifted onto me. I walked to my assigned seat, slightly off-center from the immediate family table, and sat down carefully. I folded my hands in my lap. Across the room, Daniel finally looked at me. For a moment, I thought he might come over. He didn't. Instead, he leaned toward Claire and whispered something in her ear. She nodded once. And in that small exchange, I understood something very clearly. This was not about wine. This was about positioning. And I had just been placed exactly where they believed I belonged. But I've lived long enough to know something they haven't yet learned. Positions can change. And silence is not weakness. It's strategy. As the speeches began, I sat quietly at my table and let the applause wash over me. Claire's father stood first. He told stories about her childhood, ballet recitals, straight A's, summers in Martha's Vineyard. The room laughed in all the right places. Then Margaret spoke. She dabbed at the faint pink shadow on her dress and joked lightly. Well, I suppose even expensive silk isn't immune to a little excitement. Polite laughter followed. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. While the guests clapped again, I found myself drifting, not away from the moment, but backward through time. This wasn't the first time I had felt gently repositioned. 2 years ago, at Thanksgiving, Claire had suggested we rotate holidays to keep things balanced. That year, Christmas was at Margaret's house. I was told it would be easier since her dining room was larger. Last Easter, family photos were taken in Margaret's garden. I only found out after seeing them posted online. When I asked Daniel about it, he said, "It was last minute, Mom. Last minute. There is a certain pattern in last-minute decisions. You're always the one not informed." At Daniel's 35th birthday dinner, I arrived with his favorite pecan pie. Claire greeted me at the door and said gently, "Oh, we actually ordered dessert already." I remember standing there holding that pie, feeling slightly foolish, while Margaret admired the catered display inside. Even the engagement announcement had come through social media first. "Didn't you see the post?" Daniel had asked when I congratulated him over the phone. I hadn't, because I wasn't tagged. Sitting at the wedding reception now, I realized something that felt heavier than the wine glass had earlier. These were not isolated incidents. They were adjustments, small shifts, subtle exclusions. Nothing dramatic enough to confront. Nothing loud enough to accuse. Just enough to remind me where I stood. Or where I didn't. Across the room, Claire leaned into Margaret, their heads close together. They shared a quiet comment, then a brief laugh. Daniel smiled too, though I couldn't tell if he knew why. I thought about the rehearsal dinner the night before. The long farmhouse table had been arranged, with place cards and careful calligraphy. Immediate family seated near the couple. I had been placed near the far end, beside a distant cousin I'd met only once. When I asked Claire if there had been a mistake, she smiled sweetly. "Oh no, we just try to keep the sides balanced." Balanced. It is interesting how often that word appears when someone is slowly being moved out of the center. The DJ announced it was time for the couple's first dance as husband and wife. Everyone stood. I stood too. I clapped. I smiled. And as I watched my son spin his bride under soft golden lights, I understood something clearly for the first time. The wine wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was the moment the pattern became impossible to ignore. Because stains can be cleaned. But displacement? That takes intention. And I was beginning to suspect there was far more intention here than accident. After the first dance, guests began moving toward the bar again. The energy lifted, as if the tension earlier had been politely folded away with the used napkins. I stayed seated. Not because I felt unwelcome, but because I wanted to observe. That's something you learn with age. When you stop trying to correct every misunderstanding, you start seeing things more clearly. I was watching Daniel laugh with a group of his college friends when someone approached my table quietly. It was Emily, Claire's younger cousin, early 20s, soft-spoken, the kind of girl people overlook because she doesn't compete for attention. She sat down beside me without asking. "I'm really sorry about earlier," she said gently. I looked at her. "There's nothing to apologize for." She hesitated, then leaned slightly closer. "They've been talking about you all morning. Not unkindly, not dramatically, just plainly." "In what way?" I asked. Emily glanced toward the head table to make sure no one was watching us. "Aunt Margaret was worried you might cause a scene," she said carefully. She told Claire it was important that everything looked polished. Polished. There it was again. And spilling wine confirmed her fears, Emily added quietly. I felt no anger, just a strange sense of clarity. "Did she think I planned it?" I asked. Emily shook her head quickly. "No, not exactly. But she said you seemed resistant." "Resistant to what?" "To letting Claire take the lead. To stepping back." I let that sit between us. Stepping back. It's interesting how often older women are encouraged to do that. Step back. Let the younger generation shine. Don't interfere. Don't overshadow. Don't exist too loudly. Emily lowered her voice even more. There was also some discussion about the house. My heart didn't jump. It simply slowed. "What about it?" She swallowed. "They assumed you'd be downsizing soon. Margaret mentioned it would make sense financially. That Daniel and Claire might need more space if they start a family." There it was. Not just displacement at a wedding. Future displacement. Planned. Discussed. Calculated. And Daniel? I asked. Emily hesitated. He didn't disagree. I looked across the room again. My son stood with his arm around Claire, smiling for another photograph. I thought about the house. The one his father and I paid off over 30 years. The one Daniel grew up in. The one that still carries his height markings on the kitchen wall. Margaret's voice echoed faintly in my memory. Some people don't belong at events like this. Perhaps she wasn't only talking about a wedding. Emily touched my hand lightly. "I don't think they expected you to hear any of it," she said. "But I thought you should know." I nodded slowly. "Thank you," I told her. She gave a small, almost relieved smile and stood to leave. As she walked away, I remained seated. Not shaken, not devastated, just aware. The wine had stained silk, but what I had just heard stained something far more permanent. And for the first time that evening, I wasn't thinking about embarrassment. I was thinking about preparation. Because if they believed I would quietly step back, they were underestimating me in a way that would soon become very inconvenient for them. I didn't confront anyone that night. I didn't pull Daniel aside. I didn't question Claire. And I certainly didn't approach Margaret. Instead, I stood up from my chair, smoothed the front of my blue dress, and walked toward the bar. If anyone expected me to shrink, I refused to give them the satisfaction. "Another glass?" the bartender asked gently. "Yes," I said. "White this time." He smiled politely, unaware of the quiet symbolism. No more red wine. No more visible stains. I took the glass and turned back toward the dance floor. Daniel and Claire were greeting guests at each table now. Laughing. Accepting compliments. Margaret hovered nearby like a curator overseeing an exhibition. I watched the way she placed her hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder when speaking. The way she guided Claire subtly through conversations. The way she corrected small details about the ceremony when guests praised it. She was positioning herself carefully, and I suddenly understood something very clearly. The wedding wasn't just about celebration. It was about consolidation, influence, presence, territory. When Daniel finally reached my table, Claire beside him, their smiles were perfectly arranged. "Mom," he said, leaning down slightly. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I answered. Claire gave a short nod. "We didn't want things to feel awkward earlier." "They don't," I replied calmly. Daniel relaxed a little at that. Relief flickered across his face. "I'm glad," he said. "We just want a day to be smooth." Smooth. Another word for controlled. I took a slow sip of wine. I understand, I said. And I wouldn't want to disrupt anything important. Claire's eyes met mine briefly. For a second, I saw something shift there. Not guilt. Concern. As if she sensed I was no longer reacting emotionally. That unsettles people more than anger ever could. Well, she said lightly, we should get back to the other tables. Of course, I replied. They moved on. I remained seated, but something inside me had changed. Not hardened. Clarified. The house Emily mentioned came back to me. Downsizing. Making space. I thought about the deed, still in my name. About the will my husband and I drafted years ago. About the investment accounts Daniel knew very little about. I had never hidden anything, but I had also never advertised it. And perhaps that had created an assumption that I was passive, predictable, temporary. Across the tent, Margaret caught my eye. She offered me a thin smile. I returned it, steady, unbothered. Let them believe the evening had settled. Let them believe the accident was the climax. They had no idea the real shift had just begun. Because the moment you realize you're being gently moved out of your own place, you have two options. Step back, or quietly redraw the lines. And I have never been very good at stepping back. The evening continued as if nothing significant had happened. Dinner was served. Toasts were made. Laughter rose and fell like it always does at weddings. Warm, rehearsed, selective. Margaret's dress had dried by then. Under dimmer light, the stain was barely visible unless someone pointed it out. And yet, she continued to mention it. Not angrily. Strategically. At one table, I overheard her say, it was a limited piece. They only made 3. Thankfully, it's fully insured. Fully insured. She emphasized that part. I noticed something in the way she said it. Not relief, but reassurance. As if she wanted everyone to understand that money was never the problem. It was the principle, or perhaps the performance. Later, while guests moved toward the dessert display, I found myself standing near 2 of Margaret's friends by the coffee station. I heard the dress was $50,000. One of them whispered. Margaret laughed softly. Oh, please. That's what the press said when the designer posted about it. The press. Designer. Posted. The words floated in the air. So it wasn't just a dress. It was branding. Visibility. Status. One of the women leaned in. Did insurance cover it? Margaret smiled carefully. It will. These things are protected. Protected. Interesting. Because if the dress was insured, and the stain removable, then what exactly had been ruined? Not the silk. Not the money. Not the evening. What had been damaged was image. And image, I realized, is the most fragile thing of all. As I returned to my seat, my phone vibrated softly in my purse. A notification. I almost ignored it, but something told me not to. It was from the bank. A routine alert about an account summary I had scheduled weeks ago. An account Daniel didn't know much about. Not because I hid it, but because he never asked. I looked across the room again. Claire and Margaret were reviewing something together on a tablet, probably photos already being uploaded. Moments curated before they even cooled. And suddenly, everything connected. The wedding. The positioning. The conversations about my house. The subtle reminders that I should step back. Margaret valued presentation. Claire valued control. Daniel valued harmony. And I had valued trust. But trust without awareness can look like weakness. I slipped my phone back into my purse. The DJ announced the cake cutting. Everyone gathered again. Margaret positioned herself carefully near the photographer. Claire adjusted her veil. Daniel smiled. I stood in the second row this time. Not by accident. I wasn't being pushed anymore. I was choosing where to stand. Because the dress had been insured. The stain would fade. But assumptions? Those can be far more expensive. And as I watched my son feed cake to his new wife under a shower of applause, I realized something with quiet certainty. They believed I was part of the background. Stable. Predictable. Safe. But sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding the most leverage. And before this marriage settled into its rhythm, I intended to make sure no one mistook me for disposable again. By the time the cake had been cut and the dancing grew louder, most people had already rewritten the story in their heads. The wine incident was a small mishap. Margaret handled it gracefully. The evening recovered beautifully. That's how narratives are shaped, not by facts, but by who controls the tone. I watched as Claire and Margaret made their way from group to group, retelling the moment with a polished version of events. It was just one of those unpredictable wedding moments. Claire said lightly to a couple near the bar. Margaret added, "Thankfully, nothing truly valuable was lost." Nothing truly valuable. The phrase lingered. Daniel didn't repeat their version, but he didn't correct it either. He smiled. He nodded. He kept peace the way he always has. Harmony over clarity. I slipped outside again for a moment, away from the music. The vineyard was darker now. String lights twinkled behind me. The air had cooled just enough to feel sharp against my skin. I thought about the conversation Emily had overheard. Downsizing. Making space. Financial logic. I had never once suggested selling my home. The house Daniel grew up in is not oversized. It is not extravagant. It is fully paid for. Maintained carefully. Every window replaced. Roof inspected last spring. But it is valuable. Not just sentimentally. Financially. And suddenly, I understood the timing. Marriage is a merging of assets. A consolidation of futures. If Daniel and Claire planned to expand their lives, they would need capital, space, security. And what easier solution than encouraging the widowed mother to simplify? It wouldn't look cruel. It would look practical. I stood there for a long minute, letting that settle. Inside the tent, applause rose again. Someone had started a chant for the couple to kiss. The wedding had shifted from ceremony to celebration, from structure to release. But I felt something else shifting too. Perspective. When I returned inside, Margaret was speaking with a man in a navy suit near the back of the tent. Older. Confident. I recognized him vaguely from the rehearsal dinner. A financial advisor, I later learned. They were discussing long-term positioning. I didn't interrupt. I simply passed by, close enough to hear one sentence. "Daniel will have to start thinking ahead now," Margaret said. "Families need stability." Families. The word felt different tonight. Daniel glanced over and saw me nearby. For a second, something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or calculation. But he didn't approach. He returned to the conversation. And in that moment, I realized something very simple. They had already begun planning their future. They just hadn't accounted for one variable. Me. They assumed I would follow the path laid out quietly in front of me. That I would nod when the time came. That I would step aside gracefully. But assumptions are dangerous when built on incomplete information. Because while they were positioning themselves, I had already started thinking 3 steps ahead. The wedding night would end beautifully for them. But the morning after? That's when clarity tends to arrive. And I intended to be fully prepared for it. By the time the night began to wind down, the music had shifted from energetic to nostalgic. Older songs. Slower tempo. Couples swaying under dimmed lights. I watched Daniel and Claire from across the dance floor. She leaned into him, her hand resting confidently against his chest. Margaret stood nearby again, speaking with 2 guests who looked impressed by everything they had just witnessed. The vineyard glowed softly. The evening, on the surface, was flawless. But perfection often hides the most telling cracks. I was near the coffee station when I heard Margaret's voice again, not lowered this time. "Well," she said, adjusting her bracelet, "now that Daniel's married, it's time he thinks practically. Young couples need room to grow. And with property values what they are, certain transitions make sense." Transitions. The word settled heavily. One of the guests asked, "Are they planning to move?" Margaret smiled in that measured way of hers. "Let's just say, opportunities open up when generations understand timing." I felt my spine straighten. Generations. Timing. She wasn't talking in theory. She was speaking with expectation. And then I heard the sentence that clarified everything. "His mother's house is lovely," Margaret continued, "but it's larger than she needs now. Downsizing would be beneficial for everyone." For everyone. I waited. I waited for Daniel to correct her. To say, "That's not decided." To say, "We haven't discussed that." To say anything that indicated this wasn't already circulating as a plan. He said nothing. He didn't nod enthusiastically. He didn't object. He simply stood there, holding a glass of champagne, listening. Silence is powerful. But sometimes silence is permission. I didn't interrupt the conversation. I didn't confront them publicly. That would have been dramatic. Instead, I walked past them slowly, close enough for Margaret to notice me. She paused mid-sentence. Our eyes met. For just a moment, there was no smile. No polish. Just awareness. She knew I had heard. And she didn't apologize. I gave her a small nod. Calm. Controlled. Then I continued walking. I found my seat again and sat down, folding my hands carefully in my lap. Daniel eventually approached me. "Mom," he said gently, as if nothing significant had occurred. "Are you heading back to the inn soon?" "Yes," I answered. He hesitated. "Tonight was eventful." "That's one way to put it," I replied. He gave a small, uneasy laugh. "We'll talk soon," he added. Soon. Another word that postpones clarity. I looked at my son, the boy I raised, the man I trusted. "I hope we do," I said quietly. Because in that moment, I understood something that required no anger, no confrontation. Margaret wasn't the real decision-maker. Claire wasn't either. Daniel was. And his silence told me more than any argument could have. The wedding was ending. The lights were dimming. Guests were gathering their coats. But something much larger had just begun. Because when people start planning your future without your consent, you don't raise your voice. You raise your awareness. And mine was sharper than it had ever been. I left the reception before the final song. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. I hugged Daniel. I told Claire the evening was beautiful. I even nodded politely to Margaret, who looked at me as if she had already solved a complicated equation. Then I returned to my room at the inn. I didn't cry. I didn't replay the wine incident. Instead, I opened my laptop. There is something very clarifying about paperwork. Numbers don't whisper. Contracts don't assume. Ownership doesn't depend on tone. I logged into my accounts, the primary checking Daniel knew about, and the investment portfolio my late husband and I built quietly over decades. I reviewed the deed to my house. Sole owner. No co-signers. No joint claims. I opened the digital copy of my will. Last updated 5 years ago. Daniel listed as primary beneficiary. At the time, that felt natural. He was my only child. But life changes. And when life changes, documents should too. The next morning, sunlight came through the inn's thin curtains far earlier than I expected. My phone buzzed with notifications, wedding photos already circulating online. Claire looked radiant. Daniel looked proud. Margaret stood confidently at the center of several group shots. I was in a few images too, mostly near the edge. I got dressed, packed my small suitcase, and drove home. The house greeted me the way it always does, quietly, steady, familiar. I walked through the living room slowly. The framed photos on the wall hadn't moved. The hardwood floors still held faint scratches from Daniel's childhood toys. This wasn't excess space. This was history. By 10 o'clock that morning, I was seated across from Mr. Henderson, the attorney who had handled our estate planning for years. He greeted me warmly. "How was the wedding?" "Beautiful," I said. "Productive, too." He smiled, unsure what I meant. "I'd like to review my will," I continued calmly, "and explore some structural adjustments." He didn't ask for emotional context. Good attorneys rarely do. We discussed options, trust structures, conditional distributions, long-term asset protection. Nothing impulsive, nothing reactive, just responsible planning. I wasn't cutting Daniel out. I wasn't punishing anyone, but I was removing assumptions. There is a difference. I also asked about transferring a portion of my liquid assets into a charitable foundation my husband once supported, something Daniel had never shown interest in. "Are you concerned about anything specific?" Mr. Henderson asked carefully. "No," I replied. "I'm simply thinking ahead." By early afternoon, the paperwork was in motion. Nothing public, nothing dramatic, just adjustments. That evening, Daniel called. "Mom," he said, cheerful but cautious. "We're thinking of coming by next weekend. Just to talk. About future plans." Future plans. I smiled to myself. "That sounds lovely," I said evenly. Because by the time that conversation happens, they will be speaking to a woman who is no longer standing quietly at the edge of the frame. They will be speaking to someone who has already redrawn it. And this time, I intend to be exactly where I belong, at the center of my own decisions. Daniel and Claire arrived the following Saturday afternoon. Right on time. They brought a bottle of wine, white this time, and a small bouquet of hydrangeas. Claire hugged me lightly when she walked in, careful, measured. Daniel looked around the house as if seeing it with new eyes. Or perhaps new calculations. We sat at the kitchen table. The same oak table where Daniel used to do homework. Where his father once balanced checkbooks late at night. Where birthdays were celebrated without catering or photographers. I poured coffee. No one mentioned the wedding at first. Finally, Claire folded her hands and spoke. "We've been thinking a lot about the future," she began gently. I nodded. "So have I." Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, you know we want what's best for you." That phrase always sounds generous. Until you examine who defines best. Claire continued. The house is lovely, but it's a lot of upkeep. And if we're planning to start a family soon, space might become important. Important. There it was again. I took a slow sip of coffee. The house is fully maintained, I said calmly. And it's paid off. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. We know. And that's actually part of it. The equity could really set up the next chapter. The next chapter. For whom? I let a moment of silence settle between us. I met with Mr. Henderson earlier this week, I said evenly. Both of them paused. Our attorney? Daniel asked. Yes. Claire's expression tightened just slightly. About what? Planning, I replied. Since everyone seems to be thinking ahead. Daniel leaned back. Mom, we weren't trying to pressure you. I didn't say you were. I folded my hands calmly on the table. I've updated my will, I continued, and established a trust structure for the house. The word trust changed the air immediately. Daniel frowned. What kind of structure? One that ensures the property cannot be sold without my explicit authorization. At any time. Silence. Claire blinked once. And, I added gently, a portion of my investment portfolio has been allocated to a charitable foundation your father cared deeply about. Daniel looked surprised. You never mentioned that. You never asked, I said softly. It wasn't accusation. It was fact. Claire straightened in her chair. We just assumed. I know, I interrupted gently. That's precisely the issue. Daniel exhaled slowly. Mom, this isn't about money. We just thought it made sense long-term. I agree, I said calmly. Long-term thinking is wise. I met his eyes steadily. That's why I made sure no one else would be making those decisions for me. The room grew very still. Not angry. Not explosive. Just unmistakably clear. Daniel looked down at his hands. Claire's polite smile had disappeared. For the first time since the wedding, there was no performance. No polished tone. Just reality. You think we were trying to push you out, Daniel said quietly. I think, I replied, that plans were forming around me. Without me. No one argued. Because they couldn't. After a long pause, Daniel nodded slowly. We didn't mean for it to feel that way. I know, I said. And I meant it. But meaning and impact are not the same thing. They stayed for another half hour. Conversation remained careful. Neutral. When they left, Daniel hugged me longer than usual. Claire thanked me for the coffee. The door closed gently behind them. I stood alone in my kitchen again. The house was quiet. Steady. Unmoved. The wine stain at the wedding had faded. But what that evening revealed, that would not. Because sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made at the event itself. It's made the morning after. In calm voices. Across familiar tables. And this time, there was no question about where I stood. Exactly where I've always belonged. At the center of my own life. A week after the wedding, I received a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a printed photograph. Daniel and Claire standing beneath the vineyard, arch golden light behind them. Smiling the way newly married couples do. Hopeful, certain. On the back, Claire had written, "Thank you for coming. We're glad you were there." I held that card for a long moment. Not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. There was no mention of the wine. No apology. No explanation. Just acknowledgement. And sometimes, acknowledgement is enough. The house has been quiet since that conversation at the kitchen table. Daniel calls more often now. Not about plans. Not about equity. Just to talk. Claire is polite. Careful. Measured in a different way. Margaret has not called at all. That tells me everything I need to know. I walk through my home in the mornings with a different awareness now. Not defensive. Not guarded. Just grounded. The oak table still stands where it always has. The hallway still carries faint echoes of a little boy running too fast in socks. The backyard still blooms every spring, whether anyone photographs it or not. Nothing about this house has changed. But something inside me has. At the wedding, when the red wine bloomed across $50,000 silk, everyone thought the damage had been done to Margaret's dress. They were wrong. The real stain was assumption. The assumption that I would quietly step aside. That I would simplify myself to make room. That my presence was negotiable. The wine dried. The silk recovered. But the illusion that I was unaware? That never had a chance. I don't resent Claire. I don't resent Margaret. And I don't even resent Daniel's silence that night. Because silence taught me something invaluable. It reminded me that dignity doesn't come from being included in someone else's spotlight. It comes from standing firmly in your own. I still think about that moment. The glass tipping, the red arc through the air, the collective gasp. If I could go back, would I stop it? No, because that accident did what years of small exclusions never could. It revealed the pattern. And once you see a pattern clearly, you can choose differently. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I didn't create a scene. I simply adjusted. Quietly. Legally. Intentionally. And now, when I sit at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee in the morning light, I feel something I didn't feel at that vineyard reception. Certainty. I belong here. Not because someone assigned me a seat. Not because my name was printed correctly. But because I built this life. And no one, not silk, not status, not subtle positioning, gets to redraw it without my consent. It wasn't the wine that changed everything. It was the clarity that followed. And clarity, unlike silk, does not stain. It strengthens.